It's a new day on Deep Space Nine, and Jake is observing some new arrivals. They're giving him ideas for story characters, though one clocks him and they exchange a look before she moves off. They aren't the only arrivals, as Odo returns to his office to find an old friend. Lwaxana Troy is here, and she's up the duff. She's also upset. Her new husband is of a species who believes children should be raised by those of the same sex, and she's carrying a son. He's decided he intends to take the child away from Lwaxana, despite an agreement before their marriage that she wouldn't be held to his laws. That's why she legged it here. Odo's always been kind to her and knows how to stand up to bullies. He'll make it right because he's such a good man. We'll leave him to deal with that while we check on Jake. He's observed by the woman who arrived earlier and who sits at the table next to him before striking up a conversation. She's recognized him as a writer, her having somewhat of an eye for identifying creative types, she says, and introduces herself as Onaya. That eye of hers has led to her knowing some people of note, such as a famous cardigan architect known for his bold designs. Such a shame he died so young, but bright candles and all that. She helped him come out of his shell, in fact, to uncover the talent that he was afraid of using. And she can do it for Jake, too. All he has to do is come to her quarters later for a completely innocent, absolutely above-board exchange of techniques and exercises that can't be shared in public for totally legit reasons. Still, at least his dad will be around to make sure nothing untoward happens. Or not, as he's off to Bajor for 3 days with Cassidy, a trip Jake is supposed to be joining them on. Telling his dad he intends to stay and hammer out the story he's working on leaves Cisco a little disappointed, but does give him the chance for camping sexy times with Cassidy. We're in Quark's bar, and Lwaxana is making everybody miserable. Quark wonders if it might be infectious, as she's a telepath, and it certainly wouldn't be the first time she's caused an outbreak of a mentally transmitted condition on the station. Odo decides to take one on the chin, him being immune to psychic shenanigans, and invites her for a walk. It ends at the quarters he's arranged for her, which just so happen to be right next to his. She fabricates a reason to come in, and he reluctantly agrees. It's not entirely unpleasant, though. She correctly guesses his furniture is for shape-shifting rather than decoration, an insight most people miss. She also invites him to share feeling the baby kick and nestles herself in nice and close while it's happening. It's enough to soften him up and make him apologize for how abrupt he can be, all of which doesn't matter to her as she's already fallen asleep. So he expresses himself another way instead and morphs into a blanket and pillow for her. Somebody else is being made to feel comfortable as well. Jake is at Anaya's quarters, which look remarkably well furnished for somebody who just arrived, but maybe she phoned ahead. She immediately makes it clear that despite any cues from the environment, he's here to write and nothing more. In fact, he's here to write the story he's always wanted to write, the one he was afraid of starting. A pen from another famous creative she knew is her gift to him, along with the paper to use it. This is one of the techniques she mentioned, and she motions him to write as she massages pressure points on his shoulders and head. He's so deep in concentration that he doesn't notice the golden mist she draws from him, but I'm sure that, combined with the sinister music, are absolutely nothing to worry about. Something that is worth worrying about is the arrival of Lwaxana's husband. She and Odo are playing hide-and-seek when Odo receives a call to let him know her husband's here. Getting killed a couple of seasons back has meant Kang the Klingon isn't allowed to wear his makeup anymore, so now we're calling him JR. He's annoyed at having been detained and demands to be given his son. Quite where he intends to put the fetus isn't explained, but it's academic anyway. Odo's been reading up on his laws, and they state a son is owned by the mother's husband. That's JR right now, but Odo says it won't be by the time Lwaxana's child is born. Lwaxana reacts well to Odo's offer of marriage. It's a pretty good plan, as any prior relationships are automatically nixed by a new wedding, so JR won't have a claim. They'll just wait a while, then get the marriage annulled. Problem solved. Except not quite. JR wants to be there for the ceremony, one that involves the groom convincing his bride-to-be that he loves her, and one that permits any attendee to object if they're not entirely convinced. Jake's still writing, and Onaya's still slurping gold fog out of his head. It's clearly not having a great effect on him, what with the nosebleed and all, but Jake wants to carry on writing, despite her suggestion that he rest. No rest either for Odo. It's wedding time, and he has to convince the former husband that he's serious. The first attempt goes to shit, and Jayal tries to call him out, so Odo pulls out all the stops. That means letting his guard down and telling everybody here that he's always been private, always been alone, because he feared rejection. His appreciation of Lwaxana's acceptance is honest, and the insight into how much he values this does enough to convince Jayal that he means what he says. Off Jayal goes to find another wife, while Quark invites everybody back to a party at his place, one presumably with a healthy markup on drinks prices. While they get started, Onaya's calling a stop to her party. She's entirely full of Jake's golden essence, which is a sentence that may end up getting this video demonetized. He's angry at first when she stops him writing more, but the promise that he'll do even better when he's rested is enough to placate him. Off he goes for a sleep, then changes his mind and goes to the replimat instead, before changing his mind again and collapsing on the floor. "Shit's very curious," says Bashir to Cisco, who's now back from his camping trip. Jake's brainial meats are working overtime apparently, and the stress was about to make him do a dead. He waits long enough to mention Onaya, and Cisco goes off to ask Odo if he knows the name. Bashir buggers off too, meaning the nurse, who looks a lot like a Bajoran Lita Alexander from Babylon 5, is alone when Onaya glides through a wall in gold mist mode and twats her. She's here to finish off the story, and presumably Jake with it. It doesn't take long for them to be missed. O'Brien's found some psychic wibblies in the wall, and Bashir says they dissipate after a few minutes, so they can't have gone far. It also means we can trace them by following it, and Cisco eventually finds them both in a conduit. Onaya backs away from Jake when Cisco points a weapon at her, so it's monologue time. Onaya here finds creatives and unlocks their potential, something she says she's done for a fair few famous names. Okay, she also burns out their heads in the process, but sometimes the cost of immortality is death, and Jake does so want to be immortal. Cisco's response is to poop yellow at her. It's a largely futile gesture, as she's already turned on gold mist mode, but at least she takes the hint and buggers off. Lwaxana's saying goodbye to her new husband. There's a ship off to Beta's Edge shortly, and she intends to be on it. Odo objects and says she should stay here to have her child, but she's adamant. If she stayed here for that, then she'd stay here a bit longer, then a bit longer, and then a bit longer. And all the time she'd try to make Odo feel the same way about her as she does about him, attempts she knows will fail and only serve to turn their friendship bitter. That's something she refuses to do. Jake is dealing with a departure of his own. Onaya's exit has left him wondering just how much of what he wrote was actually him. Cisco insists it was all up to Jake, and Onaya just tapped what was already there. It's something he can learn to tap himself through practice and hard work like the rest of us, so we'll leave him to declare ownership of the book that will become his first success. Until the next adventure. The MUSE. An episode generally considered to be this season's low point, and by a wide margin. If the entirety of this episode was the story of Jake and the talent vampire from outer space, I'd be quite content to leave it to its fate. The alien baddie of the week conceit has never really sat well with DS9, and this episode is no different. There are issues with that plot beyond the story itself, though. Some people have argued Meg Foster was too old to play the role, which I personally think is a misplaced criticism related to a different, far more legitimate concern. The character of Onaya is at least 2,500 years old based on interactions she says she's had. Casting a 49-year-old for that part was not the issue. The issue was the direction behind their interactions. Onaya is an alien brain drinker. Jake is a talented writer. She offers something he wants, and he has something she needs. This is a sufficient setup without adding anything else. The scenes between Jake and Onaya did not need to have sexual undertones. They were added purely to titillate the viewer, a tick in the hand shandy checkbox when following the almighty story template. If you feel that's an unfair criticism of the creative process for this one, and the direction was an intrinsic part of the story, then I invite you to use the simple test I deploy when I think about these things. Ask yourself if they'd have written it the same way had Onaya been a man. The problem was not Meg Foster. The problem was that somebody felt they needed to sex up a story about Jake. Saying it would have worked if Onaya had been played by a hot teenager is precisely the sort of thinking that leads to such cynical inclusions in the first place. Fuck all of that though, because there's another better story here. Not Lwaxana's pregnancy or her running away from Kang without the makeup, neither of which matter a damn. No, I'm talking about Lwaxana and Odo. They already have a bond, of course, albeit one that Odo struggled to embrace. Barriers forged of pain are the ones hardest to lower, and the constant bombardment of who she is turned out to be precisely what he needed. There's certainly a streak of egocentrism in her, a desire to be the protagonist in everybody else's story, but that's not the same as a lack of empathy. She could have had what she wanted here, at least in part and for a while, but she possesses the emotional maturity to see how that would have harmed them both. A creature of pure ego wouldn't have cared. They'd have taken what was there and moved on when it started to turn. By putting a stop to something before it starts, she's exhibited perhaps the most altruistic and pure show of compassion towards Odo that anybody has ever given him. It's doubly bittersweet when you realize this was Majel Barrett's last on-screen Trek appearance. She'd be around in voice work on the franchise for a while yet, but this is the last we'll see of her. I know Lwaxana's a divisive character, but as somebody who was quite taken with her, I personally find it rather sad. That being said, I think having her prevent Odo from making a mistake that would have benefited her, at least in the short term, is a good send-off for a complicated character. That it's precisely the sort of thing Odo would have done himself if the roles were reversed also gives we viewers reason to wonder whether they might have been happy, if not for Kira taking his heart-shaped goop first. Before we go, we need to have another little delve into the irregular series we call What is Odo? In this episode, Odo says he can feel the contentment of Lwaxana's unborn child. Lwaxana had felt this herself and told him about it, and it's possible she was projecting it, or perhaps amplifying the projection of the fetus. Except that shouldn't work on Odo. We've previously had mentions from Lwaxana that she can't read Odo's thoughts. We've also seen hints that he's immune to psychic shenanigans, both in being unaffected by the psychic Shagger virus Lwaxana accidentally implanted in others, and by resisting telepathic possession back in Season 1. That last point raises a wrinkle, though, as it resulted in physical side effects before the possession was ejected. If you couple that with what we're shown here, it suggests a conclusion that he's either fortified against such things, or perhaps telepathically sensitive in other ways. It might not even be telepathy in the same way that we've seen in other races. We've asked ourselves before if he has senses beyond the ones in humanoids, and this could tie into that. It might not even be a conscious thing, as he seemed genuinely surprised himself to feel the contentment of a fetus. Or perhaps that was just pleasure at the event, much like him feeling the baby move. It's not like he's particularly experienced in what you'd call family life. Regardless, the data we're given by a single line in this episode strongly suggests there's a lot more going on than a simple blanket immunity to psychic shenanigans. When you consider that he doesn't actually have a physical brain to send or receive such things, it makes a lot of sense that his relationship with telepathy would be distinctly different to what we've seen before. End of episode.
We are not playing Yu-Gi-Oh!
What about Pokemon?
I keep telling you the point of magic was to get us out, not to have a fun time.
No reason why you can't do both, miserable git.
Oh really? And how is Pokemon going to get us out of here then?
Well, Abra can teleport.
It's a fucking card game.
So was magic.
Yes, but I didn't know that.
Right, fine, have it your way. We'll do proper, down-to-earth, absolutely serious attempts to get us out of here.
Finally, We're going to treat this situation with the gravity it deserves. What's your idea?
Have you ever heard of the mystical sorcery known as Beyblades?
Exasperated sigh. Woof.